You've heard the contention before, but there are people who believe that the moon landings and the Apollo missions were not all they were cracked up to be. We've heard a lot of different versions of this story, and tonight Marcus Allen is going to present his version. We appreciate Marcus joining us on the program. Marcus, welcome to Beyond Reality Radio.
Hello, JV. Very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So the first thing, this is the first time you've been on our program, so I guess the best place to start is tell us a little bit about yourself. How'd you get started in all of this?
Well, it goes back about 20 years, maybe a bit longer than that, when I was attending a lecture, a conference in Glastonbury. You probably heard of Glastonbury with the music festival.
Sure.
But there are also lots of other things that go on in Glastonbury. One of them is a series of lectures in which actually it was an American presenter who was talking about something quite different, but he happened to mention the Apollo moon landings. And he said, well, you've all seen the photographs. I say this was about 20 years ago. That's all you could see then were the photographs. And he said, well, of course they're fake, you know that, don't you? And I thought, what a stupid thing to say. Now, I was trained as a photographer in London back in the 1960s, and I'd used the equipment which I discovered subsequently that was used on the Apollo missions, the Hasselblad cameras, and I knew what the films could do or could not do. So I thought, well, I'll have a look at these pictures and just see if he's got a point. So I had a look at them, and the only way I could find the Apollo photographs was in books at the time, and I went to an astronomy show in London and got a series of postcards which showed some of the more well-known Apollo images, and I had a look at them, and I thought, oh, I see what he means. I can see that there's a certain amount of anomaly going on here, because I'd read quite a bit about the Apollo programs. I'm old enough to have been around when they actually happened. I know exactly what I was doing. I was looking out the window at 3:30 in the morning in London, where I was at the time, and looked at the moon and waved, but I didn't get any wave back. So I was familiar with what was going on. I was familiar with the equipment, and I started looking into it. And the more I looked into it, the more I found anomalies and inconsistencies and unexplained details. And from then on, I started doing public presentations on the subject, which were quite well received, by most people who hadn't really heard of this subject before. And they were interested to find out if they had been misled, possibly. Now, having started to look at it, I got into much more detail and started to finding other people who were also examining the same area. And they were finding similar anomalies, the same ones as I was. So we decided that maybe there was something amiss. Maybe we had been misled. Maybe Apollo was the very first example of fake news. And from that day onwards, 20 odd years ago, I've been investigating it pretty well full time, looking at the photographs. Now they're all available on the internet, and one can download them and examine them and put them into various manipulation programs to see if there are any anomalies in the photographs. The more I did that, the more I found there were anomalies, such as the famous Earthrise photograph, which most people are familiar with, taken as the craft allegedly orbited the moon with the Earth in the distance. And if you manipulate the photograph, you can find out that the Earth image has been added to the photograph. It's a double exposure. I thought, well, this is a bit odd. And the more I looked at it, and the famous ones of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder being photographed by Neil Armstrong, and you can see all the detail in his spacesuit, but he's in the shadow of the lunar lander. And he's coming down this ladder. There's a series of 8 photographs which are available. Anybody can look them up on the NASA website, or the one I use is the Lunar and Planetary Institute website. It just happens to be I prefer the way they've set it out. And you download the photographs and look at them in sequence. Now, having been a photographer, I was used to looking at what were referred to, this is probably very 20th century, contact sheets. I don't know if you remember contact sheets.
Sure, yeah, it was a bunch of smaller images.
That's right. It's the images of the actual negatives. These are films, don't forget. We're not talking digital images here. We're talking films, photographic films. And if you look at the photographs in sequence, you can normally tell from looking at a contact sheet what a photographer is actually attempting to do, how he's building up to get the photograph which he subsequently uses. And I looked at these photographs, the 8 images of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder of the Eagle, the Apollo 11 lander, July the 20th, 1969. And there's 8 sequence, and there's 2 of him coming out at the top of the ladder, and then Neil Armstrong obviously gets bored watching him, takes a photograph of the rubbish bag under the lander and one of the foot pads of the lander. Now Buzz Aldrin is still coming down the ladder at this point, and then he takes another series of 6 photographs of him coming down the ladder further down until he gets to the bottom of the ladder and he stands in the foot pad of the lander. And you can see highlights of light on his heel as he stands in the pad of the lander. Now, the only way you can get a highlight of light on a heel, in this case it's a fairly shiny piece of rubber-type material, is if there is a light source to put it there. But there's no light source carried on Apollo. So there we have a major anomaly. Now, I know that a very large company called NVIDIA have done their analysis of this particular sequence of images and have come to a conclusion that it was perfectly possible to photograph it that way because of the reflectivity of the lunar surface, which throw enough light to illuminate Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder, who's actually in shadow. And then you start looking into that, and you find out that they've actually manipulated it so that it comes out like that, because the surface reflectivity of the moon is 8%, i.e. 8% of the light that hits it is reflected from it. It's similar to a road surface. That has a similar level of reflectivity as the moon does. But if you up the reflectivity to 40%, which is what appears to have happened with the NVIDIA film, you'll get enough light reflected back to show the figure as it appears in the photographs. So it's been manipulated. And they actually proved that it had been manipulated by doing this particular sequence. Anyway, I carried on investigating because there's more than just the Apollo 11 mission. That was the first one that landed. There were 2 before that, which didn't land on the moon, Apollo 8 and Apollo 10. Apollo 9 was in Earth orbit, so that was testing some equipment. Then you start looking at the rocket itself, the Saturn V rocket, that whacking great piece of kit, 363 feet high, weighed about 3,000 tons, we're told, and it was able to launch 130 tons into lunar orbit. And then of that, 46 tons were sent to the moon, to orbit the moon. And that included the lander and the command module and all the equipment needed to get down onto the surface and back up again. But if you examine the actual takeoff of the Saturn V rocket, it doesn't appear to be going fast enough to have reached the orbit speed it needed to do to launch into lunar orbit. And then you start looking at how the Saturn V rocket was built. It was designed by Werner von Braun, who was the head of the rocket assembly plant at Huntsville in Alabama. And you look at the engines that were used. Now, the engines that were used on the Saturn V rocket are called F1 engines. And they're the most powerful rocket engine ever built, we're told. But because they're so powerful, they're also rather unstable. And Apollo 6, which preceded, was the first launch of the Saturn V rocket, almost destroyed itself by what's called the pogo effect, where you get combustion instability, which all sounds very technical. It basically means that the amount of fuel that needs to get into the rocket engine is so great that it doesn't always burn at the same rate. And it sets up a pogo effect, jumping up and down, which basically shakes the rocket almost to destruction. And the reports indicate that on Apollo 6, if there had been astronauts on board that, given the combustion instability that occurred, they would highly unlikely have survived because of the sheer force that was involved. Anyway, from then on, it appears that the Apollo Saturn V rocket performed flawlessly because it launched 6 missions to the moon. Apollo 8 was the first one. Apollo 10, so sorry, 9 missions to the moon. Apollo 10 was the second one, which didn't land. Then Apollo 11, 12, 13 was the one that didn't land either. We can come to that if you like later. 14, 15, 16, and 17. And then President Nixon, who was president at the time of the Apollo missions, cancelled the final 3 that were planned, 18, 19, and 20. And those rockets and equipment were used on the Skylab launch and also the Apollo-Soyuz link-up.
You went to a presentation which presented some information that made you start questioning what the official story was, or what we had all learned or saw or assumed. Had you had any inclination prior to that there might be something amiss here?
No, this was really the very first time which I'd heard that somebody mentioned the fact that maybe the Apollo missions weren't all that they were portrayed as. And that's what set me off. I'm always interested in finding out if things are correct or not. One has obviously heard about the controversy surrounding the JFK assassination, and the moon landings, I think, come into that same category. Obviously, with the internet now, it's a great deal easier to examine things and to research them and to find out information.
So,
sorry, go on.
No, it's okay. I just want to get back to, because 20 years ago when this first was presented to you, I'm trying to put it in perspective. We did have some internet, but I imagine it was much more difficult for you to get a hold of the photographs at the time and actually start looking at them yourself. What was the process at that point?
Well, it was really, as I said, I had to go out and buy a set of photographs. I couldn't download them on the internet because there was only, remember dial-up internet?
Oh, yeah, sure, of course.
6K, I mean, it took forever to just write it. Emails were really only just coming into effect about the mid-90s, I think. I sent my first email.
Yeah.
But things have moved on very much since then, and it's really only in the last sort of 12, 15 years that it's been possible to examine this in detail. And what I discovered is there are a lot of people around the world who are examining this, and specifically the Russians. Now, one of the questions I usually get asked when I do public presentations on this subject is, well, if what you say is true, Marcus, how come the Russians didn't blow the whistle or announce that there was fraud going on or something fake happening? Why didn't they do that? Because it would have been to their benefit to say so.
Sure.
Which is something which is very easily assumed. But then if you look into it a little detail, you find out, well, the Russians would only have known what everybody else knew. They didn't have any special access to any information. They had a particularly different system of government, and it was not easy to access the information. It's only recently, since the demise of the Soviet Union, which is what Russia was, up till 1991, I believe, when the Berlin Wall was finally removed.
That's right.
And things sort of changed a bit. Now Russian scientists have started to examine the Apollo information in detail because they have access to it. And they have found enormous problems with it. The other people who've done probably more research now, it's only in the last sort of 15 years or so that they've been able to do the research. I've actually been interviewed on Russian television talking about this subject. Unfortunately, I couldn't understand what it was I said, so I assume that what I said was just dubbed into Russian. But they do have a considerable interest in the subject, especially from the filmmakers, because they're examining the films that are available. And there's one particularly interesting or quite amusing incident where some Russian filmmakers, having watched the Mythbusters program about the Apollo missions, where they claimed that they had busted all the hoax claims, the Russians decided that they would try to recreate this program, try to recreate the situation that they saw the Mythbusters had done. And they found that there appeared to be some deception involved, in that if you wear a white coat, which the Mythbusters did, or a white shirt, it will reflect enough light from the artificial light they were using to make the photograph of Aldrin coming down the ladder appear to be correct. Anyway, the Russians had sort of busted the Mythbusters, which I thought was quite amusing.